All right, I think we can go ahead and get started, and anyone else who joins will join. I think we have a few people in the office who will come in as well. But we'll get started. So I'll introduce myself first, and then tell you a little bit about what we're here to do, and then I'll turn it over to our speakers for the day. So I'm looking around the room, and I've met a lot of the people on the chat on the call, but haven't had the opportunity to meet some of you. I am Michael Martella. I'm the Program and Strategies Associate here at the Mississippi Alliance of Nonprofits and Philanthropy. Many of you are connected with the Alliance already, but if you're not, I hope you'll reach out to one of us on staff, myself, DeLorean King, Jamie Raspberry is on the call, so reach out to one of us and find out how you can get plugged in with the Alliance. I also wanted to drop a link if you haven't seen in our communications yet, we're hosting our second annual conference this April. So I put a link in the chat for folks to take a look at that conference registration page and sign up if you're interested. It's on April 25th, and we'll focus on strategies for innovating for a healthy sector, particularly in Mississippi, but more broadly as well. I wanted everyone to be aware of that. Let's see, I'm gonna make sure everybody's on mute. If you have any questions throughout the duration of the webinar, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, use the hand raising function, or to drop that in the chat. Ben and I will be monitoring that to make sure your questions get answered, and then we'll have some time at the end as well for you to ask questions, to come off mute and ask questions. Let's see, anything else? I think that's the main stuff that I wanted everyone to know, and again, feel free to pose questions if you have any as we're going through today's presentation. So today we have Jeff Moore. Jeff, do you go by Jeff or Jeffrey primarily?
Jeff is great.
Jeff is great. Okay, so Jeff is the Chief Strategy Officer at Independent Sector. And then we have Ben Kershaw, the Director of Government Relations at Independent Sector. And they're both here to talk to us about the nonprofit sector as it intersects with the new Congress and the new administration. So some of the policy related changes and impacts on the nonprofit sector. As you can imagine, if you've been following the news, they are many. So they'll cover some of the key points and the highlights where their work intersects with policy in our space. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff and Ben, and they'll say a little about themselves, and then they'll dive right into their presentation.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I think it's fair to say we have a soft spot in our hearts. I know I certainly do in mine for the Alliance. I was fortunate enough to join, among others, Janine Lee at the launch of the Alliance, which was, 5 years ago now? I think it was one of the last trips, if not the last trip I took before COVID shut the world down. Have really appreciated the opportunity to work with you and with Ellen, and really grateful for the chance to talk with you all today. Of course, there's nothing happening here in Washington that should worry anybody, so you can all just, rest assured and sleep tight. It is obviously a kind of crazy time. And Michael, it's interesting to hear you reference sort of the context of your work, your broader work of the Alliance that's focused around the health of the sector as a whole. And one of the things we love about the model of the Alliance is that it looks somewhat like the model for Independent Sector, right? That as the national organization, we are charged, as you are in the state of Mississippi, to be worrying about both halves of the whole: philanthropy, grant making, and the grant seeking sides of the equation. So I'm Jeff Moore. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer. I lead our public policy and our research functions, and I have been here about 11 years. Let me turn to Ben to introduce himself, and then I'll kick us off with some context. Ben and I will go back and forth a little bit with some questions and some commentary. We'll be sure to leave plenty of time for questions as well. And if we don't hear you or see you, just shout it out, stop us midstream. That's always fine. It is super casual. So Ben?
Thanks, Jeff. It's really good to be with you all. As Michael mentioned, I'm the government relations director at Independent Sector. So what that means usually is that I lead our work facing Capitol Hill. So I promise I'm not dressed up on y'all's behalf, though equally excited for this conversation.
I was going to say I'm feeling a little underdressed. But as you guys may know, right, this is Foundations on the Hill week. So we have been on the Hill a lot this week. Ben has been on the Hill today, and hence the tie. So otherwise, I was not on the Hill today, so you can see the sweater. So Ben, if we can just jump to the next slide. I do want to give a little bit more of an introduction to Independent Sector in case there's some on the call who are not familiar with us. So we are a membership association, and we're the only one at the national level that, as I just said, right, holds all the parts and pieces of the nonprofit, the charitable nonprofit sector. So among our members, we have the grant making community, both corporate giving programs as well as private foundations. We have operating charities. We have research institutions that work with and support the sector, all as part of this community. And we are rapidly approaching our 50th anniversary, and feel like the reason for creating Independent Sector as this table that is intended for the whole, that kind of worries about the whole, the health of the whole, is maybe more important now than ever. So a couple words about vision and mission, and then how we sort of view the health of the sector. And then I'm going to turn it over to Ben to give us a little bit of a landscape, what's happening here and now, including even today as the House tries to move a budget resolution. And then we'll talk a little bit more about legislative priorities consistent with our kind of a health framework, and then have plenty of time for questions. So at the end of the day, right, any organization that works in the charitable sector space in some way, shape, or form, right, is contributing to a healthy society, right? Helping to build a country in which all people can thrive, right? And we know that the ability of any one organization to really move the dial in that direction, that's a pretty hard thing to do. But we know that our sector as a whole, right, plays a massive role in moving the country toward a place where all people can thrive. They can thrive in a vibrant civil society and in a just democracy. And we know that in order to make that happen, to get to that point, our sector has to be healthy, it has to be trusted, and it has to be acting in ways that advance equitable outcomes, right? So in some way, shape, or form, right, we all kind of share this vision. So this is very much the starting point for IS. And Ben, if we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So I mentioned this earlier, right? IS was really created to be the place where philanthropy and nonprofits come together at one table to really think through the hard problems, right? And to address them, kind of a solutions orientation, always keeping in mind that at the end of the day, whether we're talking about public policy or we're talking about practice change, our job is to make sure that we are strengthening the sector, and we are addressing these considerable structural challenges that face us and sometimes impede our work. Sounds probably pretty similar to what you guys have as your core mission, but again, in many ways, there are a lot of parallels between our organizations. So Ben, if we can jump to the next slide. You're going to see this slide twice in the course of the conversation today, right? So when I talk about the fact that we know that in order for our sector to get us, let's see, we've got somebody saying, Jennifer is saying she's not seeing any slides. Anybody else having that problem? Okay, can we get a shout out? Other folks are seeing the slides. Thumbs up.
Can you see slides? All right.
Okay, great. Jennifer, sorry, not sure.
I'll direct
Got it.
message Jennifer and see if we can resolve that.
They're not secret. We're happy to share them later.
Okay, yeah. We can make the slides available later for sure.
Yeah.
So, I mentioned earlier, right, that we know that for the charitable nonprofit sector to be able to do the work of moving the nation toward this place in which all people are thriving, our sector has to be healthy, right? So we have for about now 6 years been developing a framework. This is kind of like our health diagnostic for how we think about what makes for a healthy charitable nonprofit sector, philanthropy and operating charities both, right? Not rocket science, not the only sort of health framework that is out there. It's our framework, and not perfect. Continuing to develop, however, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the ways in which we do this work, and in which this framework actually shapes things like our public policy agenda. So, not surprisingly, right? First, you see top left, we want to make sure that organizations in the sector are financially robust. We want to make sure that organizations in the charitable sector are powered by a thriving workforce. And we know right now our workforce is not thriving. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We want to make sure that nonprofits and foundations are trusted and well governed and effective in their work, right? And we know that for the sector, right, trust is kind of our most vital currency. If we don't have public trust, and we're talking about the trust of the American people in the work that we do, if we don't have that trust or that trust erodes, everything that we look to do becomes more difficult. Think about it. Raising money, attracting volunteers, getting communities to come in alongside you to do really hard systemic change work. If they don't trust us, we've got a problem. And then finally, we want to make sure that nonprofits and charity and philanthropies both, to the extent allowed by the law, right, are informed and active advocates in the public policy space. And I just want to pause here for a moment and remind us, right, that the changes we seek in the world, whatever our mission focus might be, the changes we seek to see in the world will not happen by themselves, right? They take our voices as advocates, whether we're advocating for funding, or we're advocating for policy change in a given program area, right? Or we're advocating for new ways of doing business and caring for our employees, right? Our voices are critically important. So that's how we think about, measuring the health of our sector. We put out an annual report that sort of scores the sector, if you will, against each of these 4 measures. So as I said, we're going to come back to this slide again a little bit later in the presentation, but I'm going to turn to Ben for a little bit of a landscape overview of what's happening here in DC.
Thanks, Jeff. So as we do that, again, apologies for the lack of beauty on this slide. We want to get you the most important information as fast as possible. So much of the legislative agenda and the legislative landscape in Washington, D.C. is shaped by the math of what happens in elections. And so, we try to start every update by thinking about what the numbers are and what the math is. So, we have a new Republican majority in the United States Senate, slightly larger than, I think some folks had expected, although not as large as they could have been. So there are 53 Republicans in the Senate and 47 members who caucus with Democrats, which again, from a math perspective, that means that anything they want to pass through the Republican-led Senate, they can lose 3 votes on and still pass it with a vice presidential tiebreaker. Republicans maintain control in the House of Representatives, although, again, I think if you were looking at this pie chart, you might not be sure who was in charge. The margins are really close, and they're excruciatingly close for the next few months while we wait for some special election seats to get filled. Again, much like this pie chart, sometimes it's not exactly clear who is in charge of the House of Representatives. That's certainly the case this week. So, speaking of this week, let's keep in mind where we are on timelines. There are a few sort of top tier priorities for President Trump and the Republican majorities in Congress. And you can see on this slide, a rough timeline that is slightly outdated at this point, but a rough timeline of kind of when they want to accomplish these 3 things. Let me just name the 3 top things that, we see as must-dos for Republicans in Congress. Number 1 is keeping the government open and passing federal funding for agencies and programs, right? So we have not yet completed funding legislation for fiscal year 2025, which began at the end of September. So by March 14th, when the current stopgap funding expires, we'll be about halfway through the 2025 fiscal year. And despite being 18 or so days away from that expiration, legislators are actually really far apart on, they're really far from reaching final agreement on this bill. There's a lot of talk that nobody wants to have a government shutdown, but absent legislation preventing one, that's what will happen. So this is an issue that there's a lot of watching in the next couple weeks, and if we're honest, probably the months beyond that. The desire to get this finished is a bipartisan desire. Continuing resolutions hurt both domestic programs that Democrats tend to love, and they hurt the Department of Defense, which Republicans love. I know you're the Mississippi congressional delegation, from the chairman of the Armed Services Committee to multiple members of the Appropriations Committees, are certainly hard at work on that issue. Overlaid with it is the expiration at the end of this year of large swaths of the 2017 tax cuts. The corporate rate reductions were made permanent in that legislation, but essentially all of the individual rate reductions, the changes to the standard deduction and the estate tax, those all expire at the end of this year. And because they expire at the end of this year, and because Republicans have control over all levers of Congress, they've made very clear that they intend to use a fast track, somewhat gimmicky process to prevent Democrats from filibustering anything in the Senate. So using this process, which you've probably heard about at this point, called reconciliation, if Republicans agree on a framework and adopt it by both chambers and can stick to those targets and adhere to this gimmicky process, they can prevent Democrats from stopping legislation in the Senate if Republicans agree. Again, 50 out of 53 need to agree on that. So right now, actually today, House Republicans are planning, still at this moment, to vote on their version of a budget resolution, which is the document that paves the way for the reconciliation bill that allows them to pass a bill without the filibuster. That is not going well, even by, sort of the low bar of functionality that we've seen from House Republicans in recent years. They can only afford to lose one vote, and they've had multiple members publicly express deep skepticism. They're trying to balance, some members who really want to extend every single tax cut and even have some of President Trump's proposed expansions with members who are really concerned about the deficit. And I'll show you a little bit more information about that in just a moment. Because of this difficulty, Senate Republicans have taken a different strategy. It's not a difference in substance, but what they have tried to do is to try to lay the groundwork for advancing energy and border security and other non-tax legislation using this fast track process. So they've adopted a much smaller, much less ambitious version of this fast track legislation. They've passed theirs through their chamber. President Trump has said he prefers one big, beautiful bill with everything in it. We'll see if that's possible. No matter how today goes or this week goes, I wouldn't expect House Republicans to give up quite yet. So just making sure I don't have things in the chat I'm missing at the moment. We look clear. I want to talk a little bit more. Please don't sweat the particular numbers here about the lay of the land on this tax and spending legislation in the House of Representatives in particular. So the yellow column that you see there is what it would take to have one big, beautiful bill. Just extending the 2017 provisions of what was called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act on the individual side, costs in the range of $4.5 to $5 trillion over a decade, but that's not enough. There are proposals from the presidential campaign to exempt tips, to exempt overtime, to exempt Social Security from tax. These all cost a significant amount of money. And, similarly, there are proposals that would reduce the deficit with things like tariffs or ending some of the Biden administration's clean energy work. There's waste, fraud, and abuse, whatever that means. Certainly, we've seen what some in the administration think qualifies as that. And House Republicans in particular are caught in this vice of wanting to spend as much on tax cuts and other border security things that are important to them and to their voters, while also not wanting to explode the deficit any more than is tenable with some of their members who are really concerned about the deficit. So they're stuck in this vice, but they're keeping at it, and they have a big opportunity if they can get all on the same page to advance major tax and spending legislation. There are a wide range of opportunities for the nonprofit sector in this scenario, and there are a wide range of threats as well. So with that context, let's talk a little bit more about kind of some of the specific items that independent sectors thinking about and working on this year.
Thanks, Ben. And so before we jump into, the specific policy proposals that we are advancing as part of our core policy agenda, and I hope each of you has had the chance to take a look at the document, Michael, I think you shared, right, which was our transition document prepared for the incoming administration that lays out everything we're going to be talking about here. And again, we can recirculate that after the call if needed. But I think everybody's had a chance to take a look at that, or at least I hope so. So in terms of proposals that specifically would help build a more financially robust sector, we'll reference two. And Ben, did you want to talk about the non-itemizer and the charitable, mileage credit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I'll put on these slides in just a minute, as long as people have a moment to think on this frame. Right now, you can claim a charitable deduction when you give to charity if you itemize on your taxes. If you instead claim the standard deduction, you don't have access to the charitable deduction. And that's not good for charities because it doesn't incentivize as many people to donate. And it's not fair to the 91% of taxpayers who miss out. And so the simple answer, you know, in our minds and in the minds of a bipartisan group of legislators, is not to recomplicate the tax code and try to increase the number of people who itemize their taxes. The answer is to just let everyone claim the charitable deduction, whether they itemize or not. Again, there's a bipartisan bill introduced in the House and Senate. It's S317, HR 801. It's called the Charitable Act, and it would give every American up to $5,000 per person in charitable deductions per year. So that's that one.
And we know these things work, right? We have seen the deduction that was available, much smaller, that was available during COVID, right? These incentives work; they matter. So go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, in 2020, in December 2020, which was the first year in a long time we had a universal charitable deduction, it was capped at $300 per person. And wouldn't you know it, on December 31st, donations of exactly $300 spiked massively, like 30%. People are seeing this and react to it, certainly at that time of year.
Ben, did you want to talk about the mileage rate quickly, and then we'll jump to workforce?
Yeah, this is a smaller issue in terms of its budgetary impact, and maybe its impact on the entire financial health of the nonprofit sector, but it's a really important one. When someone uses their personal vehicle for driving for business purposes, they can claim a standard mileage rate deduction. And the IRS determines every year, sometimes multiple times a year, what that rate is going to be. Right now, it's 70 cents per mile that you can deduct for business purposes. If you use your vehicle that's your own to bring food to your neighbors or to transport blood between blood banks, there's a statutory limit in law of 14 cents per mile that can be deducted, or that nonprofit organizations can reimburse. We haven't seen a bill reintroduced to fix this yet, but there has been legislation in recent years, and it's kind of a fundamental matter of fairness for organizations and for volunteers. So that's another area we're watching on financial health.
Thanks, Ben. I hope what you're going to begin to hear, despite all the concerns about what's happening here, is that the reconciliation process really does afford us a number of opportunities to advance the interests of our sector and to build its core strength. So why don't we talk a little bit, Ben, about workforce, and again, what it is that we are proposing as a measure to benefit nonprofit employers so they can better help their employees.
So, people who work in the nonprofit sector, they get out of bed in the morning thinking about the good that they're going to do in the world. And their organizations operate the same way, not, because we're better human beings than anybody else, but they're right. There's a tax law that says charities have to operate for charitable purposes. But also accidentally, we are a major employment sector in America. Almost 10% of private sector jobs are nonprofit jobs. And yet, there are a number of tax incentives that legislators have created over the years to try to get employers to do things they want. Things like start a retirement plan, right? There's an income tax credit for small employers who start a retirement plan, or providing paid family medical leave. There's an income tax credit for that. Unfortunately, if you're a nonprofit and you don't pay income tax, you can't benefit from these incentives, even though you might be paying a ton of payroll taxes, right? You have employees and you pay into Social Security and Medicare taxes for those employees. But unfortunately, these credits are structured in a way that just leaves out and sort of forgets that nonprofits are major employers. So we think that a wide range of these credits could be expanded to include nonprofits. Some of them are on the table for tax legislation this year as a whole. So it's just about inserting them into that conversation. In particular, one around starting a retirement plan for employees was introduced as legislation in the last Congress by Senator Lankford and Senator Cortez Masto, a bipartisan pair in the Senate. So there's some precedent there and a little bit of momentum, but a lot of work to do to equalize that landscape.
Again, an opportunity. And I'll just very quickly mention, you probably heard us preach about this before. So wage and employment data, Ben mentioned we are, 10% of the private workforce, the third largest employer of the private workforce in the country, responsible for, upwards somewhere between 5 and 6% of gross domestic product. Yet, unlike every piece and part of the for-profit sector that gets quarterly wage and employment data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, every 3 months they're getting that data, right? We have to wait 5 years as nonprofits, right? And when we get our 5-year download of data, the data we get is 2 years old. So you can imagine that when we're in a moment of national crisis, right, like we were during COVID, when we are trying to talk to policymakers about what is happening to wages and employment in our sector, we are fundamentally data blind in comparison to our partners, be they private goat farmers or limo drivers. They're getting that data every 3 months. We are not. Third largest employer in the private workforce. This is not a technical problem. It's not a data problem. It's a dollar problem. It costs $4 million a year, right? That needs to be put into the budget through the Department of Labor for the Bureau of Labor Statistics to make sure that we get the same data on a quarterly basis that all of our peers do. We have been working on this for years. Biden administration, quite frankly, could have solved the problem. They did not. We are going to do everything we can to figure out how we can serve this up on a platter for the Trump administration to get a quick win. Ben, let's talk a little bit about trust and governance, and where we see opportunities there again in the tax code, in the tax debate.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Jeff, right? You noted at the top that trust is sort of a key currency for our sector to get its work done. And as a result, it's something that we need to, safeguard and look after really carefully. Unfortunately, there are people who would use our sector's good name to advance their own selfish, illegal purposes, right? People commit fraud against our sector sometimes. And, unfortunately, there's one really simple way that people have committed fraud against the charitable sector, because there's a form to start a nonprofit called 1023. The form 1023 is what people have to file. And it used to be around the 23, 25 pages long. And in recent years, Congress created a 3-page form, the 1023 EZ. And the results show that that form is really easy for people to abuse, and a number of fraudulent charities have been started using this form. It simply doesn't ask enough information, and regulators are approving, upwards of 30-40% of applications that shouldn't be approved for charitable status. So that's something that we've expressed concern about. A few levels of Congress. Fixing that was part of some major bipartisan legislation introduced last year. So it's an issue that we're tracking. But at the end of the day, one of the major issues with stopping bad actors is that you need some cops on the beat to stop those actors. And the IRS is the agency, the tax exempt division of the IRS has seen, really insufficient funding over recent years. They've, had staff reductions as much as 30% since 2010. So there's really inadequate funding for that division. And, again, funding for the IRS is not the most politically popular thing in the world, but it's the lack of it is really having consequences for our sector and for our, for fraud.
And the reality is that given the times we are in, right, we are as a sector really under the microscope, right? And so we need to be keeping the house super clean, is the reality. So whether we're talking about things like the 1023 EZ, or other measures that we might be able to explore, some of which we are actively exploring, that would promote further transparency and trust in the operations of our sector, to the extent that those are something that could logically be pursued in this tax debate, where we're trying to figure out what those might be and see whether or not there is appetite for moving them forward. One other thing quickly on trust that I want to mention, it's not related to a policy objective, but as you may know, every year, independent sector, as part of our health report, we measure public trust, American public trust, in philanthropies and in nonprofits. And we do that in partnership with Edelman Data and Intelligence. We release that report every year, and then the findings are also reflected in our sector health report that comes out in the fall. Last year, the trust numbers in nonprofits bounced back up. They had been sort of declining for a few years, about 5 years to be exact. But they bounced back up to the point where we are once again the most trusted sector in the country, right? Better trusted than government, better trusted than the military, better trusted than the media, so better trusted than anybody. We'll see if that continues to hold. We certainly hope it does. But the point that I want to make to all of you as advocates is that this is the time to use that reservoir of trust in the nonprofit sector. When you go up and you talk to your policymakers, when you do your hardcore advocating work, right? Remember, we are trusted. We are the most trusted sector in the country at the moment, including best trusted to be the ones who can sort of knit the country back together. So just remember that. And again, we can share, Michael, it's available off the website, but a link directly into the trust report findings from 2024. We can get that out. So Ben, I know we're coming up on time here. We want to leave time for questions. We want to talk a little bit about advocacy in particular. You're on mute, Ben.
I was saying that yes, we do want to talk about it. Right. So there are rules about what charities can and cannot do, and those rules are appropriate and even essential to kind of protecting the health of our sector and trust in our sector. And one thing that's on the particular radar for this year as part of tax legislation is whether legislators will try to water down or eliminate the prohibition on political campaign endorsements and activity that for charities that has been in law since 1954. Sometimes this gets called the Johnson Amendment after the president who signed it into law, not after the current speaker, which can be confusing. So it's essential and even existential that we preserve the integrity of that rule. At the same time, we have heard reports from well-meaning charities over the years that there are aspects of the laws and the regulations and the guidance that could be clarified. And so that's something that, we've expressed interest in. We'll see how much room this year has for that level of nuance, but it's certainly a need that we've identified out in the world.
Thanks, Ben. And the only thing that I would add here, when we talk about advocacy within the IS context, we have this little mantra, this three-part mantra. We talk about rules, tools, and money, right? So Ben talked about the importance of the rules, both those like the Johnson Amendment that keep the dividing line very clear, and also those that govern what you can and can't do in terms of advocacy and lobbying, and you can do both, but there are constraints, right? There are rules. They're complicated. So as Ben said, efforts over time to make them easier to understand. And then, tools, what is it that the sector most needs, whether it is trainings, whether it is a different kind of toolkits to help us do a better job in the advocacy space. Research that we released a little over 2 years ago indicates that we are leaving a tremendous amount of power on the table as a sector because we are not living fully into our role as public policy advocates. That our activity in this space over 20 years, which is the last time it was measured, 2000, and then again in like 2022, the rates of advocacy in the public policy space by nonprofits have declined dramatically. So we're trying to figure out what are the kind of tools that are most needed to turn that curve. We also know it takes money, right? Funders need to make it possible for their grantees to do this work, not just assume that it's going to happen out of hide. So I think, Ben, that's kind of the legislative priority list for us, again, against these four sort of quadrants, the ways in which we think about the health of the sector. I know that we've got some public polling that we want to share very quickly, but we then do want to leave time for questions. So did you want to get to the polling results that we just released?
I did, and we agree we don't need to dwell on this. Just remember that chart I showed you all the cost of the tax cuts that Republicans want to do and all of the deficit impact on that. They are really, really trying to find ways, to find policies they could propose that would either raise additional tax revenues or cut spending. And we think that it would be a real mistake to look to the nonprofit sector for those. And good news, voters agree. So this is polling that was released late last week. And it's a majority of Trump and Harris voters think that taxing nonprofits to fund a bill like that is just not a good idea. Also, you've heard plenty about federal funding freezes and grants and contracts in the news. And we think it's worth highlighting that, again, according to polling released last week, a vast majority of voters want to see nonprofits paid on time and in full. Two other polling things. Again, we're happy to share the link to the full findings, but the universal charitable deduction that I talked about has just overwhelming public support, as does increasing the level of that deduction up to $5,000 per person, which is the level that's in the Charitable Act, the bill that's been introduced. So again, this is Trump and Harris. This is rural, urban, suburban. You don't get numbers as high unless about everybody agrees.
Thanks, Ben. So we've pushed a lot of information at you, so we're going to stop talking. What questions are you all holding, or reactions, pushback? What did we not tell you that you had hoped to hear?
I have probably a couple of questions. Thank you
Sure.
so much for the presentation. I'm wondering, those last couple of slides you showed with the voters and the polls and stuff, do you have any sense, or any of y'all have any sense of, since it's not an election year for Trump, I know you said that there's some vacancies and, special elections, but since it's not a general election, do you think that they're going to pay attention to what the voters want? Does that question make sense?
It's always a great question and a fair question. And Ben, happy for you to take a swing at this as well. I mean, it was a long time ago when I was sitting up on Capitol Hill as a staffer, but having some sense of what your constituency supports, right, or doesn't support, is always giving you a level of comfort or discomfort, right, around the positions you're taking. So, yeah, I do think, does the president necessarily care about these poll numbers? No. But these poll numbers are really not designed to talk to the White House. They're designed to talk to the Congress. So,
Okay, gotcha.
and Ben, would you agree, disagree? Add?
Christine, I think that right now the numbers that tell you what Harris voters want are not very useful. But Republicans in Congress are trying to find out right now what they can get across the finish line and what they need to vote for, and what Trump voters want. Right? If Trump wants it when his voters want it, and if Trump wants it, it's going to get through Congress. So I do think that I think they're paying particular attention to what Trump voters want.
Okay. And another question, if it's okay. So did I hear you guys right, when you said that it would take $4 million a year to make sure nonprofits get data in a timely manner that's kind of on par with for-profits?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know how much lobbying you guys do individually, but I would argue that since one of the major functions of the nonprofit sector is to relieve the burdens of government, that's a kind of a small price to pay. And that nonprofits could, operate more smoothly and effectively and productively. Is that a sort of argument that would fly if I wrote my congressman or man or senator?
So this is less than couch change.
Yeah,
right?
it's peanuts.
It is absolute peanuts. And again, it is not, there is a very good relationship between the nonprofit sector and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? We work closely with them. They understand the dilemma that we are in when we don't have these data. And they know how to, and they collect the data. It's not a question of not collecting the data. It is a question of revealing the data, right? And so this is a very small price to pay. I don't even like to talk about it as a price to pay. This is a matter of basic fairness, right? and addressing a data inequity that puts our sector fundamentally in a disadvantaged position, especially in times of crisis like we saw during the pandemic. So
Right.
yeah, this should not be so hard, yet it has been massively hard.
Right.
Hey, Jeff, this is Jamie. For
Hey,
those of you
Jamie.
that don't know me, I'm here at the Alliance. I'm our policy director, and I just wanted to let everyone know that we have been engaged in advocacy around that ask over the last 2
Great.
years.
Yeah.
And so the Alliance has represented our sector in Mississippi with reaching out to our members of Congress with those requests to get that BLS data updated. And
Thanks.
if you'd like more information on that, I'll put my email in the chat and I can share with anyone what we've done around that engagement.
Thank you for that support. And there are two ways to be coming at this, right? One is focus on the administration. You want this to be in the president's budget, right? This $4 million needs to be in the president's budget. And you need to make sure that the Congress actually appropriates the money, right? Listens to what's in the budget and then appropriates the money. And we have been trying to work at, on both fronts. So other questions?
Hi, this is Anna Macmillan. I just wanted to, not necessarily a question, but just wanted to thank you all so very much for dispersing this information. For many of us that's coming into the nonprofit sector, this is really good information to hear. And as we're working with other nonprofit organizations that are much larger than the smaller ones, again, this is just some very vital information for us to retain and also help in the support of lobbying and advocating for what we need in this area. So I just wanted to say thank you.
No, thank you, Anna. Yeah, and thanks for everything all of you do, right, to move those messages and to use your voices and your trusted status. Other questions? We still have a few minutes, unless Michael, there's anything else you need to do on the back end of the call with your members, but we're happy to take another couple of questions if they're there.
Yeah, we can take a couple more questions before we wrap up, if anybody has them.
Hey, I just want to add one more quick thing. For anyone who does not receive communications from the Alliance, you should, since you were registered for this. But if you do not get our emails and action alerts, let us know. I have a newsletter that I send out every month called Under the Dome, where I'm sharing, it's mostly what's happening at the state level, but we do share out federal updates and information in that as well. And you can reach out to me anytime if you have questions, because we're closely monitoring what's happening. We're partners and getting information from Independent Sector, National Council of Nonprofits, United Philanthropy Forum. And so as information does get cascaded down to us, we are sharing that out with our members and constituents across the state. But my next Under the Dome should be going out tomorrow. So we will have some updates in that as well. Both at the federal level and updates here at the state level with what's going on with our legislative session.
That's great.
Thank you. Okay, I have a real quick question unless somebody else does. I feel like I'm hogging the question time. But just real quick, like, how are we going to find out whether or not we're going to have jobs or if we're going to get funding for our organizations? I feel like there's so much information out there. I trust you guys because the independent sector, because went to grad school for nonprofits and that we use y'all a lot in terms of an excellent resource. So anyway, do y'all put out some, like, do y'all have, I guess, I'm sure you have a website that's going to tell us like, this bill has been passed, this is what it means for you, if this is implications, funding's going to stop right now, so you need to get it up, just if you see where I'm going with that, like how are we?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, this is something that under Ben's leadership, right, we're constantly doing on the legislative side, right? And that is part of, we run for IS members, we run a monthly policy update, right? So I think the Alliance is regularly on, and certainly, that is one way that we are moving information. Here's what's coming. Here's what it means. Here's the prognosis. We're not ready to launch this yet, but there is something that we have been working on, believe it or not, for 9 or 10 months, that I think we're very close to having funded, and it's going to take a little while to get it up and running. But essentially a tracking mechanism that will track both legislation that has potential for impact on the sector and litigation that is out there at a state and a federal level, right? And again, with regular updates, what we are hearing now and what we are constantly telling the funders who fund independent sector when they're asking us, what are your folks telling you they most need? It's information, right? It's like a regular, steady flow of information that is kind of just the facts, right? We'll put the commentary to the side, but here's what it is, here's what it isn't. And so that tool is something that we look to have up and running this spring, in partnership with a major legal firm. So that won't be coming from IS. That's going to be coming from lawyers, right? Who can just say, here's what it is, here's what it isn't. Anything else? Otherwise, Michael, thanks for the invitation. Ben, thanks as always for providing the information. Always happy to, answer questions. If you have them for us, please do reach out.
Yeah, if anyone has any last questions, please reach out to me, reach out to Jamie, as she mentioned. We can do our best to answer them ourselves, or we can reach out to Jeff and Ben and get information for you guys. Thank you, Jeff and Ben, for joining us. That was really good information, and we, there's a lot of change happening. There's a lot of things moving, so it's important to us that we bring good context to the nonprofits we serve. So appreciate everybody else for being here. Y'all will get a message from us with a recording from today's webinar and some of the resources that we've discussed. Give us a couple of days. We'll get it all put on our website and send that out to y'all.
Great. Michael, just let us know if there are any links that you're searching for you're not finding on our website, including to some of the surveys, et cetera. Please just let us know and we'll get them to you.
Do.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, y'all.
Bye.